The only way that you can have a genuine relationship is if you value your soul above your body, which means to say that you value the eternal part of yourself far more than the mortal part of yourself. Because the mortal part of yourself is so busy defending itself, it's so busy warding off that hateful thing that it's just not available to anybody else. There's a hum in the speakers. I remember a story I heard a long time ago, long before I ever even dreamt of being a public speaker. I was just a shy kid in yeshiva. Somebody told a story about a guy who traveled and gave lectures. He was a scholar, but he wasn't very conscious of his audience. He liked to hear himself talk. One day he's giving this lecture, some pilpul that he's giving, and most of the people are sleeping and daydreaming, except for one guy who was sitting in the front row, who was nodding vigorously, obviously approving of what he is saying. Then all of a sudden, at some point in the speech, the guy is going, so he thinks, oh, he's disagreeing. Well, I'll prove that I'm right. And he marshaled some proof, and he brought quotes and so on. And after a while, the guy is saying, so he goes on with his speech. After a while, the guy is going, so again, he marshals arguments, and he proves, and he... Finally, the speech is over. So he goes directly to this guy, and he says, tell me, where did you study? He says, me? I'm a farmer. Never studied. He says, then what were you agreeing with or disagreeing with my statements? How do you... He says, no. He says, I had a goat that got lost. I lost a goat. And when you were speaking from a certain angle, you looked like my goat. And I was thinking, yeah, this is my goat. But then you turned a little bit and I said, nah, that's... But then from another angle, I thought, yeah, well, maybe you are my goat. He says, finally I decided, you are a goat, but you're not mine. It's a pretty scary story. You can get up and make a goat of yourself. Moshe, thank you very much for the introduction. But I want to tell you a little more about myself. Something Moshe didn't mention. There's something in me that makes me very uncomfortable with other people. It goes something like this. There's a divine part that is eternal, that always was and always will be. That's the godly soul. Then there's the animal soul that is born when you're born and it dies when you die. But knowing the godly soul, it gets jealous. And it hates to think that it is not as eternal as the godly soul, so it makes like it's eternal. It tries to act like it's forever. It tries to act like it's God, actually. And as a result, not only am I insulted if you insult me, not only am I threatened if you threaten me, I can't stand you just for the fact that you exist. Because if you exist and you're not part of me, then I am not God. Then I am not everything. You're threatening my existence, simply by existing. It's the nature of the animal soul. I need to be. If you are and find no need for me, then my existence is diminished, and I can't stand that. So just knowing that you exist makes me very uncomfortable. You're my enemy just by being. That's the honest truth. Now I'm supposed to talk to you about relationships. How can two people, any two people, have a relationship with this kind of animal soul in them? This is how we're made. This is how we are. The fact that you exist disturbs my existence. Unless you become my satellite, unless you're an extension of me. And what often happens in marriage and in relationships is that at first it's a challenge to get you to be on my side. Because the more people I get on my side, the more my existence is substantiated and the less competition I have. So I need everybody to be on my side. So at first, finding a wife, making a friend, this is a great challenge. And when we succeed, it feels very good because it reinforces my existence. But once I get there, once I've achieved that, I don't need you anymore. Once I've gotten your approval, once you have reinforced my existence, what do I need you for after that? So once we get married, you start telling me what you need. I don't want to hear that. I'm not interested in that. Particularly if what you need doesn't interest me at all. So now you get to be a burden. Now you're a liability. I need to go out and make more friends. I need to get more satellites to my existence. And you're keeping me at home. Well, I don't like that. So how are we going to have relationships? Another thing. In my insecurity, in my need to be God, I need to know everything. You can't keep secrets from me. So if we're going to get married, I'm going to be very curious about those things you're not revealing. You can give me and show me all sorts of wonderful things. I'm interested in what you're not telling me. I want to know what you're hiding. I don't want to know what you're good at. I want to know what you're bad at. I don't want to know what your strengths are. I want to know your weaknesses. I don't want to know what you're good for. I want to emphasize what you're not good for. Because I'm insecure if you're keeping secrets. So if you come into my house and into my life and you say, there's a certain curtain I keep drawn, please don't look. I say, aha, that's where I gotta look. I gotta know what's going on behind that curtain. How are we going to have a relationship? It almost seems that human nature doesn't allow for relationships. What in me, what part of our personality makes it possible to coexist with another human being? In fact, when it comes to Avas Yisrael, the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew, Chassidus explains, what is loving your fellow Jew? It's such a vague, open-ended sentiment. When Hillel said, what is hateful to you, don't do to others, he was talking about a specific, well-known thing that is hateful to everybody. And that's what we don't do to others if we're going to love them. What is this thing? The thing that everybody hates, that is the ultimate hateful thing, that is the source of all other hateful things. The reason it bothers me so much that you don't respect me, the reason it bothers me so much when you say, that speech wasn't so good, the reason it bothers me so much when you say, you know, you need a new hat, or you don't know everything. I know I don't know everything. And yet it disturbs me when you say it. I know I need a new hat. Why does it irk me when you remind me of it? It can't be that I hate so many things. There is one thing that is hateful. And all these little things are just parts of that one thing. The one thing is, my animal soul, my mortal soul, lives in fear of its own mortality. And mortality doesn't mean that I will someday die. Mortality means that when they add it all up, when it comes to the tally, I will turn out to be a zero. That's what I hate. If I were sure that on a scale of 1 to 10, you consider me a 2, I would settle for that, if I could be sure. My problem is that when you say, well, you're not a 10, I immediately panic, because what I'm expecting you to say is, you're not even a 1. If I was confident, if I was absolutely sure that you consider me a 2, I would be content. There was a woman at Beis Chana once. We were having a long, heated discussion about what she should do and where she's coming from, where she's going, and what's going to be with her life, and so on. And she was having a hard time. She had to struggle all her life. It was an uphill battle all the way, and so on. So I said to her, tell me, on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think you are? Honest. She says, well, I think I'm a 8.5. She says, what do you think I am? I said, I'm quite sure you're about a 1.5. She got very upset. She disagreed. And didn't talk to me for a while. But in the end, we became good friends. If I could be sure that you consider me a 1.5, it wouldn't bother me. The thing that is hateful is not to be considered a 1. The only thing that is hateful is to be considered a 0. So I go around carrying this suspicion with me that any day now somebody is going to discover that I am a 0. And I hate that. So as soon as you say, you know, you need a new hat, something triggers in my mind. Here we go. First I need a new hat, then I need a new head, a new soul. As I am, I'm worthless. If I knew it would stop at the hat, I wouldn't mind. That's what is hateful. And that's what we mustn't do to others. If you're going to have a relationship, the first thing is, do not say anything or do anything that's going to trigger this suspicion in the person you're having a relationship with. Don't do anything that will ever suggest that, in your opinion, this person is a 0. How do you do that? The Rebbe says in Tanya, people who put their body above their soul, who value their body above their soul, cannot have a true relationship. They're incapable of true relationships. They can only have a love that is dependent on a third thing. Ahava hatluya b'davar. A love dependent on a third thing. If they happen to share a love for a common thing, that love will bring them together. If one of them loses interest in that common thing, or the common thing disappears, like money, then the relationship is over. The only way that you can have a genuine relationship is if you value your soul above your body, which means to say that you value the eternal part of yourself far more than the mortal part of yourself. Because the mortal part of yourself is so busy defending itself, it's so busy warding off that hateful thing that it's just not available to anybody else. If that's where you put your emphasis, if that's where you live, then you're not available to anybody else. The only way you can be available to someone is if you put your soul before your body. If you value your soul far more than you value your body. Which means that you value the Jew in you value the son or daughter in you value what you received from the past that has come down to you. Those things are what are important in your life. And your particular individual condition is not so important. Now you're available to another person. When you see the other person the same way you see yourself, when you look at another person, you look at what's eternal about them and not what is temporary, then you've made a real connection. When would you look at another person and see what's eternal? If you look at yourself that way. And that's what it means, love your fellow Jew as you love yourself. The way you love yourself, that's the way you're going to love your fellow Jew. If you love the eternal part of yourself, then you will have a true relationship with the other person. If you love within yourself the temporary, the mortal, the individual, then the only way you can connect to the other person is if there's a third interest that connects you and brings you together, and if that third interest disappears, the relationship is over. All of Yiddishkeit is geared towards enabling relationships, because the primal relationship is our relationship with God. Every mitzvah we do, every time we do a mitzvah, we're basically giving precedent to the soul over the body. We're saying that the eternal values are more important than the temporary ones. And that's why marriage in Yiddishkeit is so crucial. It's not just another mitzvah. It's the sign of holiness. It's the state of holiness, because only in holiness can there be union. In the worldly world, in the animal soul, there is never union. That's why Hasidus says that if a person has a problem with his Yiddishkeit, he should sit down with a friend and work it out. And he will succeed, because he will have two godly souls against one animal soul. So the question is, when you have two people discussing a problem, it's not two godly souls against one animal soul. It's two animal souls and two godly souls. So why are we guaranteed success? And the answer is, when two people sit down, their godly souls communicate, their animal souls don't. So if we're talking about my problem, my weakness, then there's only one animal soul involved. Because your animal soul has no interest in my animal soul. Animal souls are selfish. So when two people are sitting and talking together, it's two godly souls against one animal soul. There is no union in unholiness. It happens only in holiness. A couple of practical thoughts on relationships, marriage. First of all, marriage is not the beginning, but a continuation of life. Marriage means your parents got married before you were born, it continues into your marriage, your children are born, it's a continuum. This being the case, it makes sense that a marriage should in some way reflect what came before it. Makes a lot of sense that a daughter marries a man like her father. A son marries a woman like his mother. That's where we're coming from. That's what we're continuing. There should be some similarity there. In fact, it's a wonderful idea. When you're looking to choose a partner, when you're thinking, what kind of a person should I marry? Start from the beginning. Start from the beginning. What kind of a person did your father marry? What kind of a person did your mother marry? I know, the question is, what if your mother married a shlemazel? What if your father married a disaster? It's a good question. But it doesn't change the fact. You've got to start with what you have. You want more than what you have? Gesundheit, good luck. Try your best. Be better. Accomplish more. Have a more open relationship. Have a more articulate relationship. Whatever it is you want. But start at the beginning. Start with what you saw. Start with what is familiar. If you can do better, by all means, grow from there. But don't try to start a whole new project, unfamiliar, untested, because you're treading water. Obviously, this doesn't mean that the person you marry has to have the same values as your father or mother. Values change. They don't have to read the same books. Books change. They don't have to wear the same clothing. Styles change. And they don't have to have the same commitment to Yiddishkeit. That comes and goes. But the personality should be the same. If your father was a very ambitious, responsible, hardworking, no-nonsense guy, don't tell me you want a romantic person. You wouldn't know what to do with him. And you don't need it. You want somebody a little bit more romantic than your father? Gesundheit. But start with what your father had. This woman comes and tells me that she has a husband who is very loyal, devoted, nice, good. He comes home, takes care of this and that. But it's really bothering her that he's not romantic. I know this woman. So I said to her, if your husband ever brought flowers home or put a record on, you'd throw him out of the house. What do you mean you want him to be romantic? You wouldn't know what to do with it. If he brought home flowers, you'd scream at him for wasting money. Because you are a practical, no-nonsense, responsible person. If he started acting romantic, you take him to a doctor. It's a little difficult for people to admit that they are not romantic, but very few people are. Very few people are. It's too expensive. You've got to live, you've got to be what you have, what you were raised with, what you were given. If you succeed at that and can go on to even more, then you've done something. But to say, no, I don't want to be good at what they were good at. I want to be good at a whole new thing. If it's a whole new thing, you're on your own. You're making it up as you go along. You've got no script, you've got no map, you've got no tracks. So if it doesn't work, don't be surprised. Another thing, if you're not going to look for someone like your father or like your mother, the possibilities become endless. How many people are not like your father? Just about everybody. How are you going to pick from this endless possibility? You got to have a starting point. You got to begin with something. So if a guy is going to be imperfect, if a woman is not going to be everything, if she's going to have some faults, let her have your mother's faults. Those are familiar. Your father handled it. You can handle it. If your husband is going to be imperfect, let him have your father's imperfections. At least there are no surprises. And if he's going to have strengths, he has to have at least your father's strengths. Because if he doesn't have that, what kind of mensch is this? The second thing. There will be things, inevitably, about the other person that the other person is uncomfortable with. Your job is to protect that sensitive area and help them keep it private. It is very healthy for a husband and wife to have a private space. To dafka want to see what's behind this curtain, what's behind the mask, is not nice. Like they used to say in Yiddish, a schlechter Mensch. It's simply not nice to go tearing people's masks off, unless you get paid to do that. It's not nice to go poking behind the curtain that a person spent so much time and so much effort putting up. Our responsibility to each other is to be sensitive to each other's sensitivities. Not to ridicule them, not to be uncomfortable with them, but to be sensitive about it. If I marry you, I take responsibility for you. And that includes your weaknesses. It includes your sensitivities. It includes your mask. It includes your privacy. Final thing is, if we're going to have a relationship, I have to be very one-sided about it. I can't constantly be measuring your response to me. I have to be single-minded that my job is to take care of you. If I'm constantly measuring, questioning, am I giving more than I'm getting? Are you getting the better end of the deal? Am I more than you deserve, but you're not more than I deserve? If I'm constantly questioning that, I'm undermining the whole relationship. Because a relationship, if it means anything, means the application of goodness in everyday life. That's what marriage is. If you have any goodness, if you have any virtue, if you have any love, if you have any compassion, if you have any kindness, if you have any loyalty and devotion, what are you doing with all that stuff? What are you doing with it? What are you going to do with it? Applying goodness to everyday life is marriage. The person who says, I have so much love to give, but my wife isn't interested. Not true. Nobody can resist being loved. You're holding back. Why are you holding back? Who are you saving it for? If you have love to give it to the person you're married to. You say, well, but she doesn't love me back, or I love her more than she loves me, or I loved her 2 years and she's only loved me a year and a half. When I ask her, she doesn't say convincingly that she loves me, and she only said it once this week. If we're worried about that, then we're coming from the animal soul. The animal soul isn't capable of loving anybody ever. The godly soul is perfectly willing to love the person you're married to. So do it. And the same with children. The person who says, I have a lot of love to give, but somehow it's not working out with my children. Save it. Be proud of the fact that you have a lot of love to give. What good is this? Who are you saving it for? Later on in life, we realize this was not a chachma. So to sum it up, the problem with relationships is that one person's existence threatens the other person's existence by nature of our animal soul. If you look at me the wrong way, if you in any way imply that you are not a satellite in my existence, then you are my enemy. No in between. You are either mine or you're my enemy. That's the nature of the animal soul. If we're coming from that place, if we're coming from the animal soul's orientation, then forget relationships. It's a myth. It's a game. If we're coming from the godly soul, then we need to do three things. Number one, be there unconditionally. You have goodness, you have kindness, you have love, give it. Don't keep taking your pulse all the time. Don't save it. Give it to the person you're married to. Number two, don't look where you're not invited. Don't be curious and determined to dafka see what the other person doesn't want to show. And thirdly, work with what you know. Don't get off into fantasies. Don't try to build your life around a fictional character. Work with reality. Start from where you grew up and work from there. Then the relationship will be a blessing for generation after generation, because that's what marriage is. It's the beginning of all the future generations. And so when we bless a couple who are setting off into married life, we say this should be a binyan adei ad. It should be an eternal edifice, a structure that will last forever, because it does last forever. It carries over from generation to generation and so on. You're going to marry someone like your father, your daughter, your son will marry someone like you. You marry someone like your mother, your daughter will marry someone like you. And by the way, let's assume your mother didn't do a wonderful job. You've got complaints. She wasn't so good at communicating, she wasn't so good at advising, she wasn't so good at expressing her feelings, she didn't mother, she didn't bond, whatever the words are. And the result is you. Now you're going to get married, and you're terrified that you're going to do to your daughter what your mother did to you. And so you hesitate. First you hesitate getting married. Then you're finally married, you hesitate having children. You finally have children, you hesitate to say anything to them. You're not sure if you should ever discipline them because maybe that's going too far. Or you need to discipline them a lot because your mother didn't. What could be the worst thing? If you made every mistake your mother made. What could be the worst thing? That your daughter will be like you. And have the same complaints to you that you have to your mother. So what's so terrible? What's so terrible? In fact, by today's standards, that would be considered great success. We should wish it on ourselves. Our mother wishes it on us. You should have a daughter like... That would be a blessing. That would be a blessing. If we could know that 30 years from now, our daughters will be sitting here talking about how imperfect their mother was, that would be wonderful. So don't hesitate. Make your mother's mistakes. Have children like yourself. With a little help, they'll have greater opportunity. They'll do a little better than you. And then you have something to show for all your efforts. Something that can never be taken away. In the final analysis, there are a couple of people in the world to whom you really count. Only a couple. No matter what you do, there are only a few people to whom you really count. Your spouse and your children. You've got to make the most of it. Some reaction, please. That's not what I meant. Thank you, goodbye was not what I was looking for. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how we all have the same kind of parents.
We all do. So we all I mean, the way we judge our parents' relationships, or those of us who are products of divorce. So, how can you just go back to that point and try to focus in on that so we can,
okay.
In other words, you have to live with what your father was.
Right, right. First of all, I think that this is why in the olden days people married off their children before they were too smart. That's when the kids still thought their parents had a wonderful marriage. It's a good idea, by the way. Not very feasible, but a good idea. When you get to be more than 14, you start noticing your parents' imperfections, and it's very frightening. Obviously, youth is very idealistic, and no matter how good your parents are, you're going to be better. You're not going to make this mistake, you're not going to make that mistake, you're not going to be so old-fashioned, you're not going to be so uptight, you're not going to... Yeah, you will be. Almost guaranteed you will be. Because marriage has certain demands, and lifelong intimate relationships create certain inevitable conditions that you have to live with and deal with, even though in your idyllic picture of what your marriage is going to be like, you didn't take that into consideration. There are a number of layers to this. First of all, the model. If you're going to visualize a marriage for yourself, you have to use real-life models. And of course, your parents are the most immediate, the most fleshed-out model of married life. If you don't use them as a model, anybody else is going to be second best. That's one thing. The other thing is, not only are your parents useful models for you, but you are, in most cases, a reflection of your parent. So not only is your mother a model for how to be a wife and how to be a mother, she is a model of how you're going to be a wife and how you are going to mother, even if you don't intend to. It shouldn't be a surprise, and it shouldn't feel bad when you find yourself in marriage with children sounding like your mother. Because you are like your mother. Now, when a woman says, or a man says, "Not me," no way, no way, I am not like my mother at all. We have this discussion every session in Beis Chana. One summer, we were talking about how daughters are like their mother in basic personality traits. And this woman became very vehement. And she said, "That may be true of others, but it is not true of me. There is nothing I have in common with my mother. She is pushy, she is loud, she is opinionated." We are. Not only because they're our model, but because they are the clay from which we are made. I don't know if I mentioned a story last year, but it's a powerful story. The Kotzker Rebbe was talking about certain chassid with other chassidim. And the chassidim were amazed at how intimately familiar the Rebbe was with what made this chassid tick. He knew him so clearly, he described him so perfectly. So they mentioned another chassid. They said, "What about Chaim Yankel?" And the Rebbe described Chaim Yankel with the same intimate, exact detail of what made him tick and how his mind worked and what. They were very impressed. So they mentioned a third chassid. What about that? And again, the Rebbe's insight into the chassid was awesome. Finally, one chassid said, "What about your son?" To the Rebbe, "What about your son?" So the Kotzker said, "You're asking me if I know my son? I know with what thoughts I brought him into this world." Having children involves the entire person. What you put into it is what determines the result. We are made of the clay, the flesh and blood of our parents. So before we even get to know them, we are like them. When people say to a little girl, "You're so much like your father," they're not doing her a favor. They're making her crazy. When the mother says, "Go talk to your father, you're like him," that's terrible. She can't be like him. He's going to grow up to be a daddy. She's going to grow up to be a mommy. She can't be like him. And it's usually not true. Very often a daughter will have her father's talents, but her mother's personality. And when people say, "Oh, you're just like your father," they're talking about talents. They're not talking about personality. To push a daughter towards her father is not a good idea. To push a son towards his mother is not a good idea. A mother should encourage her son to talk to the father. A father should encourage the daughter to talk to the mother. But the father who competes with the mother for the daughter's attention is being selfish. He's not doing his daughter a favor. When in psychology they tell you that your problem is that your father was too dominating, that your father was too intimidating, that your father was this, that, and the other. The problem is not what he did or what he was. The problem is that whatever he was doing, he was distracting you from your mother. The problem is not that you have a father. The problem is that you lost your mother someplace along the line. And the same in reverse with a son. It's not that the mother was so domineering or was so controlling. It was that you didn't focus on your father. So it's what was left out that's causing the damage, not what was there. So for these reasons, it is safer, more predictable, and more successful when we follow, first of all, our personality, which is similar to our parent, and that role model with which we are familiar and comfortable and capable and so on.
If the role model ended in divorce, you want to follow that?
Yes.
Yes.
Not that you want to get divorced. If it ended in divorce, why would you want to get married at all?
Well, it's hers, not mine, so I don't know. But if that was the point she was raising, I was curious as to what the answer.
Okay, if your parents ended up in divorce, why are you taking a chance at marriage?
No, but I guess my point, I mean, I understand how you limited it to child rearing, but I was really more focused on the concept of, for instance, if your parent, it has X characteristic, which, by the way, I'm not sure I understand, because you seem to be related, gender characteristics, like man to man, like mother to his daughter, and father to his son. But I'm talking about, there's certainly, they say in psychology, you marry your mother, or you're not mother, or your father, or you're not father. That's a very classic dyad in psychology. But what I'm trying to say is, I mean that by this such up that you're linked into the idea, well, my father was whatever he was, it's what I know, it's a dynamic I recognize, so I'm going to marry that. And you are probably attracted to what if it was abusive, or what if it's illegal, there's something worse. Violence or something or anything, I've counseled people from that background. What if that's what it is? How do you reconcile that?
Okay, let's connect it with divorce. If your parents get divorced and you're going to get married, what are you doing? What gives you the confidence? What gives you the confidence, hopefully, is that in the back of your mind, even as you were growing up and watching them fight and so on, you could see how if they just made a little adjustment, it would be perfect. They don't need to have a frontal lobotomy. Huh? They just need to make a little adjustment. And so you say, well, I can make little adjustments. But if you think, if you believe, if you feel that your parents' marriage was a colossal disaster, you're not getting married. You will not dare to attempt marriage. The same thing is true for the parents themselves. When are the parents going to consider remarrying? Not as a backlash, a healthy second marriage. Interestingly, they would consider marrying a second time when they can look back at the first marriage and say, a little adjustment and it could have worked. Not that they want to go back, it's done, but they can now see that had they made a little adjustment, or the other had made a little adjustment, it wasn't such a colossal mistake. It was two people who were not wise enough at the time to bring it together. But as long as you feel that your first marriage was a total disaster, then you haven't got the courage to try again. The same is true with even an abusive family. Obviously, you don't want to repeat the abuse. But to go to the opposite extreme, say your father had a terrible temper, and he was a controlling kind of a person, uncomfortable with anything happening that he wasn't in control of, So you're going to say, well, I'm going to marry somebody who is so laid back and so gentle and so mellow. It's not going to work. It's too far from what you're familiar with. So what you have to do is this. Take the personality of your father, who was abusive. Take the personality. Imagine that personality without the abuse. A controlling person, an intense person, a person with a temper, but with some self-control. Now you've got a more realistic picture. You don't want a mellow kind of guy. You want someone who is strong, who is reliable, who will be the loud one in the family, because you don't want to be, but not with the violence, not with the loss of control. So, abuse is not a personality trait, the abuser. What we're talking about is basic personality traits. Aggressive, non-aggressive, ambitious, not ambitious, gentle, hard, kind, severe. We're not talking about misbehavior. If your father is a ganef, it doesn't mean you have to marry a ganef, because that's not a personality trait. That's a moral value or lack of moral value or something. Also, there are times when you look at your mother and you don't see any similarities between yourself and her. Because in many superficial things, you really are different. Your mother is shy and you're very outgoing. But if you look a little deeper, you'll find that there is a more basic personality trait that you do have in common. I had this discussion with my sister-in-law. And she says, it sounds interesting, but I don't think it's true because I don't see any similarity between you and your brother. If every son has basically the same personality as his father, then all brothers should be alike. So she says, I don't see it. I don't see any similarity between you and your brother. I said, tell me, what is your biggest complaint to your husband? This is my sister-in-law. I said, what is your biggest complaint to your husband? She says, well, he's always doing for others and neglecting his family. Story of my father's life. There are certain things that will be a theme in the family, and that's the core personality. Yeah.
In a classical Jewish marriage, does the marriage continue on into Gan Eden after the partners die, or is it just for this life only?
If it's a good marriage, it continues on into Gan Eden. If it's a bad marriage, it continues on elsewhere.
So it continues on.
Yes. Yes, the souls of husband and wife are related in heaven. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but that's it. Yeah.
What you're saying to me, is it as follows: if I'm introduced to a woman, I'm to look at her and say, well, you're not like my mother, so cancel that. Is that what you're saying? Is that your prescription?
No. I'm not saying cancel it if she's not like your mother. If you meet somebody and you feel comfortable and you like her, marry her. It's only if you're trying to figure out what kind of woman to be looking for, then use your mother as the model. Chances are that this woman who you like and are comfortable with and you're about to marry, she is like your mother. You'll find out later.
So, if I have Shadchan or Shadchanit working for me, maybe I should introduce her to her.
I think that it is essential for a shadchan to know the family. This, walking in off the street and putting your name on a card and they give you another card, I mean, this is not real. This is not a scientifically thorough shadchan. Yeah.
What happens if you don't like your mother?
Chances are you won't like your wife. I don't mean that facetiously. I really believe that you're not truly going to be comfortable in your marriage until you get comfortable with your parents' marriage. It can't start. It has to continue. When you get married, you are continuing what your parents started. If you're not comfortable with what they started, then there's a discomfort built right into your marriage.
So I'm hearing from you then that dysfunctionality is a multi-generational, incurable disease.
I didn't say it was incurable, but it is multi-generational, yeah. Let me put it this way. In order to be a well-adjusted person, then we're getting into the bigger picture, outside of marriage. In order for me to be a well-adjusted person, I have to have a well-adjusted view of my father. If my view of my father is distorted, then I am distorted. If I think my father was a total loser, then what am I going to be? I'll make a lot of noise, I'll be a big shot, I'm not going to be like my father, in the end, I will be a loser. Because if my father was a loser, then where am I coming from? On the other hand, if I think my father is a tzaddik, he is a saint, he is bigger than life, I'm in bad shape. I can't compete with him. I can't be like him. I am left behind in the dust, and I will spend the rest of my life apologizing for my existence because I'm not good enough. If I think my father is a loser, I will spend the rest of my life complaining that I got shortchanged. I got a lousy father. The only way I can live my life like a mensch is if I have an adjusted view of my father. He was not the greatest tzaddik in the world. He was certainly no loser. He was an okay guy. Then I can go ahead and be an okay guy. And the same with a daughter and a mother. Before I can set on my path and start living my life, I have to be comfortable with the life I was given. My parents, their marriage, the way they treated me. Obviously, if they treated me really bad and there is true abuse, I have a handicap. I don't have the equipment. I don't have the necessary tools that will assure me of a successful life of my own. So I have to somehow compensate, overcome that, but it's a challenge. To be comfortable with your parents makes you comfortable with yourself. It's not a profound psychological thing, but it's very true. You have to be comfortable with your parents. And as we get older, we become more comfortable with them. We look back at them and they weren't so stupid after all. And they weren't such schlemazzles after all. And they weren't so cruel after all. They were human beings. Not perfect, not terrible. And in the end, if we can be like them, it also wouldn't be terrible. With a little more Yiddishkeit, maybe, it'll be wonderful.
Well, I think what I'm asking is if a mother, and I've seen this over and over again, if a mother is emotionally unavailable, she just can't help it. She doesn't know how to disclose, she doesn't know how to make emotional contact. She's a nice person, but that's part of the way she is. So what happens is that perhaps a guy will grow up with a mother like this, and he'll continue to choose women that are emotionally unavailable. He keeps repeating this pattern, and he can't get a committed relationship. So, I mean, there's a case where he is looking for somebody like his mother, consciously or unconsciously, and it's just perpetuating dysfunctionality.
But let's not overdo it. Dysfunction can be almost anything. A woman may not be able to emotionally express herself the way we would like, but she is available to her children because she's always there. It's another way of bonding.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
No, you can't underestimate that.
Well,
I was talking to a woman. I was
People cannot commit to one another.
I was talking to a woman in California who had spent, 12 years in various therapies. And she tells me, as we're standing in the Chabad house in Berkeley, and she says, after all these years, I have finally worked out my relationship with my mother. I understand her, I forgive her, and I'm going on with my life. And I said, you forgive her? That's nice, but do you have a mother? She broke down crying. 12 years of therapy. She fell apart. What happened was that her mother was distant, unavailable, blah, 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 critical. And so she was determined that she would never do this to her children. She got married, has 2 teenage children. She saw herself repeating her mother's mistakes, so she left. She left. Hasn't talked to her children in over a year because she's working out. I said, your mother was infinitely better mother than you are. Your mother never thought of leaving. We overreact, we overdo it. Yes, parents have their faults, but they were there. They were parents. They stayed. If they left, you've got to find the healthy part to connect to instead of focusing on what was missing. A mother, not all people are equally emotional, but they're there. They had the courage to have children. People who say, well, I am not going to make the mistakes my parents made, I am not going to have children. That's not a chachma. At least your parents gave you life. So look to the positive and build on that. The mistakes, they'll heal. They'll get better with time. Yeah.
Let's assume that a person goes to a concert, for example, in Carnegie Hall, and here's a great violinist playing a marvelous Stradivarius violin. Perhaps the initialities of the Brahms Concerto may sound jagged, they may sound rough, when the neshama of this perhaps great artist is being thwarted from communicating to the other audience or the other person, as I'm making an analogy. As a result, that maybe the violin itself, the Stradivarius, needs to warm up a little bit before the mellifluous tonal essences it has to give, in conjunction with the artist, are realized in the totality of the situation. With that particular type of mindset, would you kindly suggest a gambit or an opening such that a person from a Torah perspective could approach, for example, either a young lady, and from a Torah perspective is a young lady, such that the Torah essences are perhaps most proficiously and efficaciously divulged, such that perhaps the very decent people who, upon getting a chance to know each other with a environment, so would not be shut out as a result of these circumstances.
What is this question? Before you answer this question, I know this guy for 3 years he was looking for a girl. He couldn't find one. He finally found one who looked just like his mother. He brought her home. His father was mine.
When the father says to the son, don't make the mistake I made, he's not giving good advice.
What I was saying is how does one approach, what do I say?
Is that what you were asking?
The Gemara in Gittin was written before the Gemara of Namish, continuation because the Gittin.
You say, would you like to meet my mother?
If they would accept that, I would.
The father who wants for his children what he never had, and the mother who wants for her daughter everything she never had, is not creating a path for the children. She's basically wiping out the footprints, destroying the tracks, and saying, now you do better. It doesn't work.
How do you view this initially as your intent?
You intend to repeat what your parents did, because what they did was good. Yeah.
I'd like to points that you made together. You talked about relationship being respected and put up. But in a close relationship, it seems to me, especially when I was talking about a wise person, it seems to me that a wise person who cares about someone else can help the other person heal or whatever. And you can't do that unless you encourage the person to move forward. Not that you can move forward. You have to encourage the person to do so. Otherwise, what's behind the curtain won't sit there. Would you talk about the balance between respecting that privacy and that sense of boundary on one hand and
Helping them grow. One of the things that Hasidus introduced into Jewish life is the idea that if you struggle with your evil inclination, you perpetuate it. Sometimes you're better off not struggling. Sometimes you win the war by not creating one. There are many things that we would like to see improved in our children, in our spouse, and we can be tempted to attack it and take the bull by the horns and try to impose a solution or work at a solution. Very often, the problem would disappear if you just let it. Sometimes flexing a little bit into the problem makes the problem relax and go away. Even in medicine, in holistic curing, they're putting a lot of emphasis now on stop trying to push in the opposite direction. Go with the pain and it'll let up. So sometimes supporting the sensitivity makes the sensitivity go away far faster than if we attacked it and tried to eradicate it.
but you have to get behind the curtain enough to know what the sensitivity is to it.
Not necessarily. If you're going to attack it, then you better know what you're attacking. Yeah.
I mean, you have to be aware of it, and if it's really well hidden, you can be insensitive because you just know, not because you intend to.
No, what I'm suggesting is that if you go with it, if you permit it,
But that means the cognizance of it, whatever it is, if it's well concealed and it's still operative, that's, in a sense,
yes. I'm only suggesting that if you're going with it, you don't really have to know all the details. If you're going to try to cure it, yes, of course, you know it's there because you get a reaction. You know that when you step in the wrong space, you push the wrong button, you get a reaction. You don't need to know exactly why, where is it coming from, you know that that's a sensitive area. And if you allow that sensitive area its privacy for a while, it heals. So again, sometimes more quickly and more thoroughly than if you're going to lance it and go through the whole of it. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused by one of the answers you gave about what happens in after life. You said if you have a good marriage, you continue upstairs. If you had a bad marriage and continued downstairs? What if you had two marriages, one was good and one was bad?
Divorced 5 times.
No one ever said marriage was easy. 2 marriages is... I was only semi-serious about that. The relationships do continue into heaven. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to live together. You're related. After, I mean, you know, the people who have had the near-death experiences, it's a fascinating subject. One of the common things that near-death experience people describe is that when they're in that place, relatives come to greet them. And very often it's a wife or a husband. So obviously, in that level, there is still a bond between a husband and wife.
Seriously, are you referring to the first wife?
Not necessarily.
There would be more than one.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah. But that itself, by the way, the near-death experience is a fascinating subject because it used to be that there were no atheists in foxholes. We've progressed a little bit. Even in the foxhole there can be atheists, but not in a near-death experience. Nobody comes out of that an atheist. It's interesting. Yeah.
Two things I wanted to ask you. One was to ask you, this young lady, about people who were raised with extremely violent parents. I'm a therapist, and I work with some people like that. And you were saying that these people would have to do a tremendous amount of fixing before they could have a marriage. So are you saying that people like that shouldn't even think about getting married, or what do you suggest?
No, I think people like that know that they're going to have a rough time, that they have a lot to overcome, and that the healthiest thing for their marriage is getting comfortable or at peace with the way they were raised or the kind of father or husband their father was.
Well, I mean, like in Israel, for example, there are many women whose husbands have been like convicted for beating them up, and the husbands refuse to give them a get. And there's thousands of women like this, and I know, and I've spoken, all over the Orthodox world, there's many women, or their husbands are busy saving the world and neglecting the children extremely. And so I'm just saying, in a situation like that, let's say they're in that situation now, they've already picked a mate just like their father, and they're in the situation, their children are being damaged. You're suggesting they should stay in that marriage and try to work it out?
In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, this quick knee-jerk reaction, get out of there, is not always.
Like years and years, and the other person doesn't do it. The women always go to therapy for this. The men, they're very, it's like even in New York City, there's dozens of groups of women who've been battered. There's not that many men who are harming others that want to get help, therapy. Unless even the courts force them to, they don't really are into it.
Yeah.
So I just meant, like in Judaism, what does Judaism say about that? After years of trying, should the woman just stay with it, or husband doesn't give her a get? What does she do?
Depends on the individual case. But there are cases where they are better off making it work, or at least
The
trying.
husband doesn't want to make that little adjustment.
It's a tragedy, can I tell you. But one thing I have to caution.
What do you do?
One second.
Stay with it?
Yep, you have to be able to leave your work at the office. And I mean this for everybody. We read about these things in the papers, we hear about it, we talk to people who have gone through it, but we have to leave it in the office. You don't take it back home to your marriage or to your parents and say, yes, I think my mother was also an abuser. Don't get carried away with it. There are tragic instances where there is actual violent abuse, but they are in the very small minority. It's a very rare occurrence, and you do not ever consider yourself rare. You always consider yourself the norm, not the exception. So the exception, yes, it exists, but not by me. We shouldn't all come home and become part-time therapists, or even worry about it. That's why when I say you should go home and support your spouse and protect their weakness and their sensitivity, everybody says, but how are they going to get healed? So they won't get healed. What are we talking about? Violent abusers? No, we're talking about human beings. Yeah.
I want to say that I make it a positive. There's another dimension to abuse. On a mother's portrait. And I think that from my friend's perception and seeing different households, there's something that's an emotional or verbal abuse that sometimes can be more deadly and leave more scars than any kind of actual abuse. That was just a thought. And one of the things that this gentleman had mentioned about a mother and complaining about distance and the mother not being there, I just wanted to connect that with that young woman's question about an abusive father. He was there. I mean, he was abusive. He was inept. He controlled his emotions, but he was there. So that's just to bring that together in terms of what you said was really powerful. I think having this young person work through and accept the parents and what they are. I had the good fortune to listen to one of your tapes in Chicago, the tape on marriage. And I was wondering if you could share with us, because I'm assuming as you have so, about the wedding ceremony, the relationship that it was very, I'm divorced 14 years, by the way. It takes a lot to really encourage me to get married again. However, that tape on that one part that discussed the actual marriage ceremony, how our relationship is with Hashem, and their beginnings, and that just like you getting married, this whole aura. You know what I'm referring to? Then you take on relationships of marriage. You want to know what I got out of it? You want me to try to do it, or you remember what I'm saying in terms of
I think the tape.
conduct of the couple, and that they go, that what the couple represents.
I think I made that tape before you got divorced. It was a long time ago. I don't remember. But if you want a thought on the beginnings of a relationship, relating it to God, God says through the prophet that for all time to come, whenever things are tough between us, when we're not behaving ourselves quite the way we should in our relationship with God, God says, I will always remember the kindness of your youth, when you followed me into the desert in a barren and uncultivated land. The beginning of every relationship, if it's going to be a marriage, permanent, for keeps, forever, that kind of, has to be a leap of faith. It can't be a carefully plotted thing. It's a leap of faith. And it's that leap of faith that will overcome all the difficulties in the marriage. Because the fact that you are willing to make that leap with me, the fact that you are willing to follow me into a desert, into an uncharted path, into an unknown future, that ultimately is the strongest and the most precious compliment that you've paid me. It's what makes marriage unique. It's what makes it worth healing and fixing and salvaging and struggling with. So when we go to the chuppah, it is a leap of faith. We don't really know each other. We don't know what lies ahead. You never know a person until you've been married to him. And yet we do it. And that blindness, that leap of faith, is not the weak link in the marriage. It is the strongest link. Two more questions? 2 more minutes? You have 2 questions?
What is it that's, I know from a religious point of view, but from a rational point of view, the concept people being together for marriage. And there's that kind of relationship that's a reality also.
Before marriage.
Before marriage. And people usually explain that as getting to know each other. What's wrong with that? On a rational.
What's wrong with living together before marriage? Well, it depends on what you're hoping to get out of it. If you're hoping to have companionship, it's wonderful. If you think that this will lead to a better marriage, where have you been the last 10 years? It doesn't work. It simply does not work. If you're looking for marriage, the worst thing you can do is have a half a marriage, a partial marriage, a mock marriage, a trial marriage.
What's wrong with companionship
Nothing.
compared to marriage?
Nothing. It's not a marriage. But the argument has always been that if you spend some time together and you get to know each other, then if you decide to get married, it'll be a wise, mature decision, and then it'll be a successful marriage. It's not true. It's simply not true. People who have lived together before marriage get divorced as often, if not more often, than people who didn't live together. So the statistics have disproven that theory. For a very simple reason, by the way. What is it that makes marriage difficult?
Are you going to tell us, or are you
Yeah. It's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara says, a man must see the woman he is going to marry before he marries her. Not in the modern sense of seeing someone. The Gemara means literally, you have to look at her, see her, before you marry her. So the Gemara says, why? What do you have to see her for? And the answer is, because if you marry her without seeing her, and then it turns out that you don't like what she looks like, you will not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew. That's the reason. My question is, what's the difference? If you don't like what she looks like, if she's really that disgusting, then you're not going to like her whether you marry her or not. So what does it have to do with marriage? If you're worried about your inability to love your fellow Jew, well, if somebody looks terrible and you can't love them because they look so terrible, then what's it have to do with marriage? How does anybody fulfill the mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael when there's an ugly Jew? The answer is, if you're not married to her, she's not so ugly. The problem with marriage is that this is yours forever. That's what's difficult to take. If she isn't mine, or it's not forever, then she's fine. I would recommend her to my friends. But if I'm married to her, and it's forever, this is going to be my life forever? That's what bothers us, right? If you have a trial marriage, what are you finding out? What are you discovering? Nothing. Nothing. You live together for 8 years, and it's wonderful, it's bliss. You get married, and that week, nothing works anymore. Because now it's forever. All of a sudden, she's ugly. All of a sudden, I can't stand that habit. Because now I'm going to have to live with it forever. So whether you're going to be a good husband or a good wife really ultimately depends on how do you handle the forever things in your life. How is he going to behave if he was stuck with you forever? How are you going to find out? How do you test this? You can't test it by living together for a while. It's not a valid test. The one difficult ingredient that makes marriage such a challenge isn't there if you're only living together. So what is that going to tell you? You will know more about how this person can handle a permanent, lifelong relationship by finding out what he thinks of his father. What does he think of his parents' marriage? Again, if he thinks it was a disaster, he's not very good at long-term relationships. If he thinks it was pretty good, then he's comfortable with long-term relationships. If he thinks it was wonderful, that's the best. So, how he reflects his parents' marriage is an indication of what he thinks of lifelong relationships. How he treats you on a date doesn't tell you anything.
Another question. I know where I come from, there's a very clear way for people to meet each other. The shidduch. People, family recommends, and it's a very structured way, and it's very safe. And it's nice. Here, on the west side, just over the while that I've been here, there isn't that safe way to meet someone. The pool is it's more wide open, and I see people who are constantly struggling, and it's very frustrating to get in there and find someone. You have the word of advice for
Before a person gets involved in a relationship, to any degree at all, that could even possibly become serious, you first check with a third party. You never do it on your own. If we're doing it within our family, then somebody would come to a boy in Crown Heights and say, would you be interested in meeting, I don't know, ask my father. I am interested, but I can't do it until I ask my father, ask my mother, ask my older brother, something. If you don't have your father, mother available, ask your rabbi, ask an older friend, a married friend, but never do it on your own. There are much less significant things in our lives that we would never think of doing without first consulting an expert. But when it comes to marriage, we're ready to run off and do it on our own. Or at least tamper with it and play with it for a while, and then say, oh my God, is this the person I want to marry? Now I suddenly want advice. If you ask experts before you buy a car, if you read up on it, and you check with Consumer Report before you make an investment of $1,000, it's certainly wise to, if you meet somebody very casually, and you're thinking maybe we should see each other again, the first thing you do is introduce the person to your rabbi, to your older friend, to someone who can give you an objective evaluation. It doesn't have to be a brilliant evaluation, just an objective one. That's much safer.
How to meet them in the first place. Because the problem is on the introduction level, not just how to go on, who to connect with, to begin with. Just what I...
Well, it seems like people are meeting each other all the time. Meeting doesn't seem to be the problem.
They're meeting, but they're walking right past each other. All the time. Just a lot of people who would seem to me at least possibly matching each other, don't
miss each other.
All the time.
I think it's probably because with so many options and so many possibilities, you simply have to block it out and go crazy.
So that's it.
But if you stop doing that, there are no infinite possibilities. Before you consider anybody, you check it out with an advisor, with your witch doctor, with somebody. then you're not so intimidated and you're not so overwhelmed by all these possibilities, and you can focus. You can take a look and say, well, maybe I'll check it out with somebody. Doesn't mean you have to run over and introduce yourself. You ask, you inquire, you say, who knows this person? What do they do? You do it more as a community and not as an individual. Then you're not so intimidated, you're not so afraid, and you don't have to put on the blinders. If you really are having a hard time and you're not getting anywhere, then to use the old-fashioned approach is still very good. Find an older friend and say, look, I'm sick and tired of being in the market. Find somebody for me. You do it. It works. We have time? 5 minutes. Yeah.
To me, like, you know, someone like a woman at the car, or a man at the car, like some your friends like a Japanese car, rather than like Japanese car because your friend who uses like Japanese car. You don't have to rely on your friend's car, but you should rely on the person of the car. I think it's more important what your family thinks.
What your family thinks?
No, I don't think what your friend or your family thinks, but someone is the most important and the most valuable thing to do. Like, because you can't bring the person to a car, which I think is not fair at all.
I guess that's why people don't think of consulting with their family, because marriage is such a personal thing, but it really isn't. It really isn't. Marriage is not just a feeling. Marriage is a system, and the system has certain rules. Some things work and some things don't. And an objective opinion is maybe not the most important thing, but it's a good place to start. We certainly shouldn't be ashamed of consulting. Yeah.
Not a theoretical and therapeutical question. Determinism that you talk about is these things perpetuate themselves over generations. Is that the animal soul? And if it's the animal soul, is there a way in which you can deploy the godly soul to do an end run around this, what starts to sound almost like a Freudian sins of the fathers being visited unto the end of generation? I mean, is there a therapeutic dynamic whereby you can short-circuit the bad?
Yes, in marriage.
But in marriage.
Once you're married, then you stop agonizing over the differences you have in your animal soul, and you bring your godly soul to bear to kind of envelop the animal souls and bring them closer. But that's a job. And before you get married, you don't want to look for trouble. You want to look for someone you can marry with the least amount of difficulty and friction. So before you're married, you have to take into consideration what your animal soul says, because you don't want to aggravate it. Once you're married, it doesn't matter what it says. Your godly soul should overrule it.
So then just to follow this out, then marriages that don't work, the relationships that fall apart, let's say there is a real incompatibility between the animal souls. Had the godly dimension been brought to bear, then those marriages would have worked and the problem would have been overcome.
Or at least put into perspective. Yeah. In other words, once you've decided that you're going to be married and you are married to each other, then it becomes a moral issue. It's no longer a personality issue. When you're thinking, should I marry him, should I not marry him, then it's a personality question. Once it's your husband or your wife, then how you treat her or him becomes a Jewish question, a moral question. You have to be good to your wife. That's what our grandfathers always said. And then it's not then personality is not an excuse anymore. Then it becomes a question of goodness. One more question. Yeah.
Just a comment and a question. I think the whole point that you made, I agree with starting with your parents, and thank God there's a lot I have to start with. But I think what what's maybe a little frustrating, and this is really the question, is that I think people think they can do better, and I don't think that that's inconsistent with Judaism. I think in terms of personal growth, the whole point of being Jewish is to grow stronger and better. And if there are things that you feel will make you a better person that may be not present in your parents, not even things that are have a moral quality, just the things that you might need to nurture your own growth just weren't there, I don't think there's really a problem with seeking that out. I think just like you can learn from every person, you should of course learn and find the good in any marriage, in your parents' marriage, but I think it's important to move beyond that it's not enough to just say, that's not a bad place to start. It isn't a bad place to start, but the other half of that is, how can I find a way to improve that? And my question is probably related to Rabbi Kugel's question is, how do you, intellectually, I think most people can buy into the concept of having faith in Hashem will find their share, recognizing that it's not good to feel jealous and insecure. I don't know if that's the animal soul or just basic neurotic West Side living. But how do you, when you intellectually realize these things and yet emotionally still experience them, what you were suggesting, is that what was you were just suggesting before, to just let go of it, to stop struggling with these feelings rather than trying to intellectualize them away?
If a person feels perfectly comfortable marrying better than their parents, and it comes naturally, and maybe the father was a loser, but the son is a genius and a success, then fine. It happens. The person who is determined to fight this tendency and become different is doomed. If it's a struggle, give it up. If it comes naturally, go ahead. Go shoot for the star. So the person who says, well, maybe I'm the exception. Maybe I'm a genius. Geniuses are born to dumb people. So maybe I'm not like my father. If you're not like your father, go right ahead and be whatever you are. Somebody said to me, a guy who did hit his wife. And I said to him, you realize that you're following your father's... So we talked about that. And he said, no, he doesn't think so. He's very different from his father, and maybe most people are like their father, but there's always the exception, the genius who goes off and becomes exceptional. I said, that may be, but geniuses don't beat their wives. If you're an example of a genius, So if what is the expression? The more you resist, the more it persists. If you resist being like your father, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to make any progress at all. If you naturally rise above the fray and you are just naturally gifted, then there's no reason to discuss it. Then you're doing fine. Don't fight it is the crucial thing. Right. Don't fight it. Go about your life with what you know to the best of your ability, and if your father may have made $1 million in his lifetime. You want to do better than that. In order to do better than that, you first have to make the same $1 million. You can't skip the first $1 million and say, no, I'm going to make $2 million. In order to make the $2 million, you have to make the first $1 million. You want to be better than your father? Go right ahead. First catch up to him, then pass him by. But if you haven't even caught up yet, how are you going to be better? So, of course you should be better than your father. And with God's help, we will all have better marriages and healthier children and so on. But first we have to catch up.
Partner with Rabbi Friedman. Visit itsgoodtoknow.org/support.